Elias moved to the edge of the world because the center of it had collapsed. After the funeral of his late wife, the silence of their city apartment had become a physical weight, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He bought the secluded woodland property, hoping the ancient trees and the lack of a cellular signal would act as a shroud for his mourning. The house was a modest thing, built of cedar and stone, but it was the neighboring estate that commanded the landscape. It sat like a tomb behind a 12-foot stone wall, topped with rusted iron spikes. There were no windows on the visible side of the massive structure, just a smooth gray face of stone that seemed to absorb the sunlight without reflecting it back. On his third morning, Elias stood on his porch with a mug of bitter coffee, watching the neighbors. A dozen figures emerged from the estate, all dressed in pristine, bleached linen garments. They moved through the meticulously kept gardens with a synchronized mechanical precision that made his skin crawl. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked up. Their faces were vacant, as if they were reading a script written in the dirt. They weeded and pruned in a rhythmic dance, their movements so identical it felt like watching a single organism with 20 arms. Their presence was a silent intrusion on his isolation, a community of ghosts living just beyond his property line. The first time Elias met Brother Silas, the air felt thick, as if a thunderstorm were about to break. Silas appeared at the edge of the fence, a man with a smile that was far too wide, and eyes that seemed to hold a desperate, flickering intensity. He introduced himself as the leader of the Order of the Pale Sun, and offered Elias a small, ceramic jar. He called it a welcome gift from the hive, his voice carrying a smooth, melodic quality that felt like honey over broken glass. When Elias opened it later, the honey inside was dark, almost black, and it smelled faintly of copper and ozone. It did not smell like flowers. It smelled like a laboratory. He left it on the kitchen counter, untouched. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. That night, the humming began. It was a low-frequency vibration that Elias felt in his teeth before he heard it with his ears. It was not a mechanical sound, like a generator, but more like 1,000 voices chanting a single, deep note just below the threshold of human speech. As the sound intensified, Elias felt a warm trickle on his upper lip. He wiped it away to find his fingers stained with dark red blood. His television flickered into a static snowstorm, and the digital clock on his microwave began to spin backward at a dizzying speed. He tried to turn off the lights, but the switches did nothing. He stood in the kitchen, paralyzed by a fear that felt older than the earth itself. The next morning, Elias found small, hand-carved bone figurines buried every few feet along his property line. They were shaped like humans, but with elongated limbs and no faces. They felt cold to the touch, forming a silent, subterranean fence. Later, at the local post office, a missing person poster caught his eye. It was a young man who had vanished 3 months prior. Elias stared at the photograph, his breath hitching. The jawline and the slope of the shoulders matched one of the gardeners he had seen through the fence. The vibrant student had become a hollowed-out shell. Returning home, Elias felt a psychological shift. He was no longer a neighbor, but a specimen under a microscope. The estate loomed closer, its windowless walls acting like a giant eye that never blinked. He woke at 3 in the morning to a terrifying silence. When he clicked on his flashlight, he found his bedroom was empty. Every piece of furniture had been moved into the living room, arranged in a semicircle facing the neighbor's estate. On his pillow lay a single golden coin, gleaming with a malevolent light. The coin felt cold, and the silence was now a predatory thing. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The golden coin on his pillow felt like a brand, a heavy weight that defied its small size. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain just a fraction, his hands trembling. Outside, the moon cast a pale, sickly light over the property line. There, standing in a perfect, horizontal line against the stone wall, were the neighbors. Dozens of them. They were dressed in their white linen robes, which glowed like phosphorescent bone in the dark. They were not moving. They were not chanting. They were simply standing perfectly still, their heads tilted upward at a precise angle, all staring directly at his bedroom window with wide, unblinking eyes. Their silence was more deafening than any scream, a collective void that seemed to suck the very air out of the night. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Elias crept toward the boundary wall the following evening. A small, ragged voice drifted through a narrow fissure where the stone had begun to crumble. It was Maya. Her voice was a fragile thread, trembling with terror. She warned him that the Order of the Pale Sun was not just a group of eccentric gardeners. They believed that the universe was born from a primordial silence, and that by stripping away all noise, thought, and individuality, they could invite an ancient, hungry entity back into the physical world. She told him she was being prepared for something called the Great Harvest, a final shedding of the self. She begged him to help her escape before the moon reached its peak, promising that the boundary markers were not just bone, but keys to a lock he did not yet understand. Panic surged through Elias as he retreated to his house to call for help. He reached for the landline, but the receiver offered only a hollow, dead silence. He checked his cell phone. The screen was a scrambled mess of jagged lines and distorted shapes. Sprinting to his car in a frantic bid for the city, he found all 4 tires had been sliced with surgical precision, the rubber yawning open like hungry mouths. He was trapped in the center of their web. While searching for a weapon in the darkness of the basement, his flashlight beam caught something unusual behind a stack of old, moldy crates. A wooden panel, rotten with age, gave way to reveal a narrow crawl space. It was a tunnel, lined with the same cold, damp stone as the neighbor's wall. The architecture suggested it had been there long before his house was even built, a secret artery leading straight toward the heart of the estate. Brother Silas appeared at the edge of the woods later that day, his presence as intrusive as a cold wind. He did not mention the slashed tires or the dead phones. Instead, he spoke of Elias's late wife with a terrifying familiarity. He claimed that the veil between life and death was merely a curtain of noise, and that in the absolute silence of the order, Elias could hear her voice again. He promised a reunion, a way to mend the shattered pieces of his grieving heart. It was a seductive lie, wrapped in the language of empathy, designed to weaken his resolve. To see the reality behind the honeyed words, Elias used an old telescope from his attic. He watched a cleansing ritual in the estate's hidden courtyard. A young man was forced to stand inside a circle of white salt. He remained there for 48 hours without food, water, or sleep, his body swaying like a reed, while the others watched him with predatory patience. The horror of the young man's vacant eyes broke the spell of Silas's manipulation. Elias knew he could not wait for morning. Armed with a heavy metal wrench and a flickering flashlight, he crawled through the subterranean tunnel. The air grew colder and smelled of damp earth and something sharply metallic, like old blood. He emerged into the basement of the mansion, a place of vaulted stone ceilings and shadows that seemed to move on their own. He crept through the silent, sterile corridors, searching for any sign of Maya, until he reached a heavy oak door at the center of the house. Inside, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with wooden shelves. On those shelves were thousands of cassette tapes, each one labeled with a date and a time. He clicked a player on the desk and froze as the audio began. The voice coming through the speakers was his own. It was a recording of him crying in his sleep from the previous night. They had not just been watching him. They had been recording every breath, every sob, and every secret he had ever uttered in the supposed safety of his home. The tapes were still spinning when the shadows in the room coalesced into solid forms. Elias did not have time to swing the heavy wrench before cold, gloved hands pinned his arms. They dragged him deeper into the estate, down a spiral staircase, descending into the very crust of the earth. The darkness here was absolute, pressing against his eyes like a physical weight. The air grew thick with the cloying scent of frankincense and something sickly sweet, like rotting meat. They threw him onto the cold stone floor of the solar chamber, an underground cathedral built in total dark. Above him, a massive dome was etched with celestial maps that did not match any known stars in the sky. Brother Silas stepped out from behind a massive pillar of obsidian, his white robes shimmering. He looked down at Elias with a pity that felt like a sharpened blade. Silas explained that Elias was never a random neighbor who happened to buy the house next door. They had searched for months to find someone whose grief was as pure and resonant as his. His sorrow for his late wife was not a burden. To the Order of the Pale Sun, it was a finely tuned instrument. They needed the frequency of a broken heart to bridge the gap to the primordial silence of their deity. Elias's pain was the fuel for their great harvest. The robed figures surrounding him began to hum. It was a subvocal vibration that Elias felt deep in his marrow. The sound was less of a noise and more of a pressure. The stone walls hummed in response, a low-frequency thrum making the air shimmer with heat. Dust shook from the ceiling, and hairline cracks spiderwebbed across the floor. Suddenly, the air in the center of the room curdled and a shape formed. It was her. His wife stood there, bathed in a soft, ethereal light, reaching out her hand to him. She looked exactly as she did on the day they first met, smiling with a warmth that promised an end to his loneliness. Elias wanted to surrender, to walk into that light. But then he saw Maya. She was strapped to a stone altar nearby, her eyes wide with terror, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The hallucination of his wife flickered, her eyes turning into black pits of void. Elias realized the entity was eating his memories to manifest itself in the physical world. He lunged toward Maya with a desperate roar. Simultaneously, Maya managed to kick a ceremonial brazier into the heavy velvet tapestries. Flame roared upward, sending plumes of thick black smoke into the air. The sudden chaos broke the focus of the chanters. Elias tore at Maya's restraints, his fingers bleeding as he fought the heavy leather straps. They ran, not looking back as the mansion began to groan and buckle. The ground beneath them shuddered with a localized earthquake, and the air itself seemed to scream as the foundations gave way. As they burst through the front gates and collapsed onto the grass of Elias's own lawn, a deafening crack echoed through the woods. The entire estate, the stone walls, the windowless mansion, and the underground cathedral collapsed into a massive, yawning sinkhole. It was as if the earth had simply opened its mouth and swallowed the Order of the Pale Sun whole. When the police arrived hours later, they found nothing but a hole filled with grey dust and the sharp scent of ozone. There were no bodies, no tapes, and no records. Just piles of empty white linen robes scattered across the rim of the pit, as if the people inside had simply evaporated. Elias moved to a bustling city 3 weeks later, desperate for the noise of traffic and the hum of a world that never sleeps. He could no longer tolerate silence. He kept 3 radios playing in his apartment at all times, the overlapping voices creating a shield against the quiet. One evening, while unpacking the very last moving box, Elias felt a cold object at the bottom. He pulled it out, and his heart stopped. It was a hand-carved bone figurine, elongated and faceless, tucked into the corner. He dropped it, but the room did not go quiet. Even with the radios blaring, he heard it. A low, rhythmic humming. It was not coming from the walls. It was vibrating behind his ribs, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. The silence had not left him. It was now living inside his own chest.